I'm Matt Wilhelmi, and I'm the owner of Strategic Voyages Business Consultants. I'm also the author of Taboo Business Questions, What's Haunting Every Entrepreneur's Growth. And today, I'm joined by Marva Sadler. Marva is a small business, high-stakes problem solver, focusing on issues like partnerships, operations, exits, financial turnarounds. Marva specializes in taking immediate and decisive action to maximize organizational outcomes. She also has an MBA from BYU, and she's a Theory of Constraints Jonah. Marva, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me, Matt. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, and so, in this first episode of our series, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about our backgrounds, and then we're going to jump into a case study, which I'm really looking forward to. But I'm going to tease that just for a moment because I think that your background is really, really interesting. You've spent some time in a number of different industries, in manufacturing, in professional services, financial turnarounds. And so I'm wondering if maybe there's a story or two, or maybe an experience or two that really helps to highlight maybe the parts of your career that would maybe our viewers would find the most interesting.
I think I'm going to just confess. A lot of people look at my background and say, that woman must have career ADD. Because as you've said, it's a very eclectic mix of different things. And at the core is this strategic problem solver, this creative process. I started out as a strategy consultant with Bain and Company, and the big strategy firm. And I developed a reputation fairly early on of being able to take projects that we'd never done before. Because we did a lot of cookie cutter cost reduction or initial strategy analysis kinds of things that were you could almost write a handbook for them. And then the consultants could go do that. And, Anderson Consulting took that to a whole nother level with their standardization. But in the early stages, there was a program or a product that the client would ask for. They'd ask for a project that nobody had ever done. And I developed a reputation for being able to take those and do something with them that was really valuable for the client and really creative and created something new that we could do. And I realized that that's where I like to play. I don't like to play in the standard kind of cookie cutter stuff or the prescribed solutions. I like playing on the edges where there's a new question that's being asked. And I found that as I do that and as I move from industry to industry, the underlying issues are very similar. And the creative process of finding solutions is the thing that I specialize in as a result of that. And that's why I jump around, is because I've never found a problem I didn't like. Problems and I have a really close relationship.
Marva, one of the things I wrote down in my notes when we were kind of getting to know each other in our first call was that you really love gnarly problems. And I think that word is kind of a fun word. First of all, it starts with a G, but I think that gnarly is an interesting word that we don't use too much, but it does kind of actually highlight the types of problems that you talk to me about and told me about in your background. And so I think when people are looking for an advisor these days, they don't want somebody who has worked at the same place for 20 years, because that might not give them the ability to kind of see the whole landscape and to understand maybe the problem from a number of different perspectives. Whereas with your background, not only do you have the education, you also have the applied experience. You've been doing this for quite a while. I think that it's an interesting background that I would imagine a lot of your clients really embrace. And so in today's episode, Marva, we're going to get into a case study we'll highlight here in just a minute, but it is a manufacturing company. And the reason I say that is because with your Theory of Constraints Jonah background, I'm assuming that really, really kind of plays hand in glove here. But there's probably a wide, portion of the audience that maybe doesn't quite know what that is or isn't familiar with that. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could explain that a little bit more in detail.
Sure. In the late 80s, a physicist named Eli Goldratt wrote a book called The Goal that is now kind of standard reading in pretty much every MBA program that there is. And I was at Bain by the time that book was written, and I got a bootleg copy of it before it was published and read it because I was working on a manufacturing problem and just loved it. And so, fast forward years, I had the opportunity to get an executive kind of education program beyond my MBA, and I selected to go to the Theory of Constraints program that the Goldratt Institute set up. And what it is it really is a set of thinking skills that help in problem solving. It was originally created specifically for manufacturing and for resolving really difficult problems of excess inventory and slowed process times and roadblocks that caused production to break down. And it evolved into becoming a strategic tool for marketing, for strategy, for essentially for pulling gnarly problems apart and identifying their core issues and finding creative solutions that essentially meet all the needs rather than meeting a single need and solving a piece of the problem. And that's why it fascinates me, because it's a really systemic look at the entire organization and all of the dynamics going on, instead of just selecting one thing that you're going to optimize and then realize that it has 6 or 7 negative impacts that you hadn't thought through.
So I would probably assume then that the theory of constraints, background is going to be something that you use quite often in your profession these days, right? I mean, it's not something that you took a course and it's nice to know about and maybe talk about. You're actually using it every day, right?
I am. I don't pull it out and say, oh, I'm going to use a theory of constraint tool. But it's always in the back of my mind. I'm always thinking about the kind of the process to go through, the way not to get stuck on a predetermined answer just because you've used that answer before. And also, I have a tendency, even in services companies, to talk about the issues as if they were manufacturing problems. Yield loss, wait time, things like that are very classic manufacturing measures, can also be applied to any set of processes. And when you start thinking in those terms, and you can see the universality of it, it brings to different venues really different solutions, because people start to think of things in a much more creative, much more flexible manner.
Yeah, so that sounds a little bit like, divergent thinking. It's almost like a different way of approaching a problem. It's seeing the problem from a number of different angles and quickly evaluating the best way to move forward. And so I would assume that that's helping you with, your consulting business, and your clients are really appreciative of that perspective of being able to have a multidimensional approach to some of the problems that you're solving. And I think that's a great segue into this particular case study, Marva, that we're going to get into, which is a manufacturing company. And one of the ways that I'm typically brought into companies is through a trusted advisor. I don't do a lot of cold calling. I don't, need to do those types of things. But oftentimes the people within that company see problems, know that there are frustrations, but they don't necessarily know what the root cause is of them. And one of the ways that I've been able to build my company is by being a great resource and educating some of those trusted advisors within these organizations. And so specifically with this one, it's a manufacturing company that needed some financial help. And so what they brought me in to kind of do was to take a look at their financial systems, really kind of understand their job costing model, and help them with some of those kinds of issues. But what I started to learn was that they actually had a much bigger picture. And this is what I'm hoping that you can help me solve today. What they wanted to do, Marva, is they had a business model where they would manufacture their products and they would distribute them all over the country, very small orders at a time. And what they started to realize is it wasn't very cost efficient. They were losing tons of money. They weren't able to be not only a manufacturer, but they are also realizing now we have to be a distribution company, and we have to be an educational company, and we have to do all of these different things to kind of get the word out about our product, make it, deliver it, sell it. It's a tough thing to do all of those at once and do them all well. And so from your background, I'm hoping that we can get into this, because I would assume that, you're already maybe thinking about, some of the ways that you would approach some of their issues, but, really kind of specifically as they were working with me and I was solving some of these financial problems, they really wanted to shift from that direct to consumer model to more of a distribution model. And so what would be some of those questions that you'd want to ask to kind of understand, what they were thinking about, or maybe how they were going about it?
So just to make sure that I understand the underlying situation, they started as a manufacturer. They built a sales force. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they do have a couple of account executives, and what they manufactured was basically sold and installed at restaurants. And so, as I'm sure you can imagine, there's several million restaurants across the United States. Keeping track of all those accounts by 3 account executives is a tall ask. I don't care if you're the most brilliant account executive in the world. That's a lot to keep track of. And so that was their model. They would manufacture it literally in the same warehouse and then sell it with one of these 3 guys to one of the restaurant owners. But they were getting calls left and right. There were issues that needed to be resolved on site at some of these restaurants, and they didn't have kind of the manpower to be able to handle some of those things.
So I'm going to break this up into a few different sets of questions. Let's talk about the people to begin with. Did they have a high-level champion who really understood what it was they were trying to accomplish and who really bought into that?
In terms of the sales, or in terms of this business model shift?
In terms of the business model shift.
They did. Yep.
And that individual had a rough project plan or outline. They understood what the big phases were going to have to be.
Yeah, I think it was a good starting point. I'm not sure it was as well executed as the plan probably could have been, but there was a plan. I think that one of the problems was that this person didn't necessarily properly evaluate the talent around the organization, because the people were complaining that they were burnt out. They were saying things like, I'm sorry I missed that deadline. I just have too many other things to do. And so a lot of times, you've probably seen this more than me, but when you're trying to implement change in an organization, there does need to be a change management champion, and somebody who kind of says, yeah, I know that that's an issue. I'm sorry that you're dealing with that. We're still going to push forward. We're still working towards something. And so they did have that person, but I'm not sure that the people were well equipped to be able to make that change.
Okay. So that's one of their problems. And so let's move now to the financial aspects of it. Did they have the cash on hand to be able to weather the decrease in revenue that was going to come in the first wave as their consumer sales slowed down, but their distribution had not really started driving collections yet?
That's probably one of the bigger concerns that a lot of organizations have, right? Do we have enough cash on hand? And I bet a lot of CFOs, if you polled, just in general, would answer that question. No, there's never enough cash on hand. And so I would answer the same way. They did not have enough cash on hand. I think what they were trying to pull off was a pretty monumental shift. And so to think about it this way, they were processing thousands of orders a month, thousands, but they were almost all less than $1,000. And so it's really not high ticket items, but it is high volume. And so when you're doing that much volume and you want to shift from that high volume to now a distribution model of a low volume, obviously you're going to see that financial pinch. But it is really tough to kind of forecast how long specifically that might be. And so they had about 6 months of reserves, kind of ready to go for this transition. But I don't think that they accurately forecasted, and maybe this happens more often, you can maybe relate here. I don't think they forecasted accurately, truly the financial impact of this shift in going to this distribution model.
It's difficult to know what you don't know till you're in the middle of it. And that having contingencies available to you and having thought through not necessarily exactly what it's going to look like, but what some of the possibilities are so that you don't waste a lot of time trying to figure out how to respond, is part of making a big shift like this. Had they done any scenario planning?
I do think that they had some contingency plans, but I'm not sure that they really loved the options B and C. I think they were very much focused on option A. Do you see that a lot when you're working with clients where they game plan those things out?
No, not when I first get there, but definitely by the time we're ready to implement any big change, we have done work around really game planning to say, okay, here are the 3 most likely things that could go wrong. We don't know which one will, but we know one of them will. And what are going to be our responses to that, so that we don't get bogged down in the OMG, we didn't realize this was coming. Now what are we going to do? The sky is falling. Instead, it becomes, pull out this plan. And it may not be a really well-defined plan, but the biggest risk is in that moment, make sure you don't panic. Something bad goes wrong. How do you move in the right direction so that it doesn't become a hole you can't survive?
Yeah, I think I've heard the term, you can actually grow a company into bankruptcy. I'm not sure if you've heard that before, but it's certainly a real thing. Business owners maybe don't want to admit it, but they have these grand plans, these aspirational goals, and it all looks good on paper. I think it's Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank who says he's never seen a projection he doesn't like. And so, the projections always look good. Well, right. I mean, that's like part of the job of a projection. It's got to look sexy. The arrow's always pointing up. And so it's always a 10% growth. Well, why? Well, it's 10%. I mean, sometimes the projections don't make sense, but in this particular case, you've kind of hit the nail on the head pretty quickly to kind of, get to the root cause here. The number one issue is the people. I'm not sure that it was, the best executed plan, but even if it was the best executed with the wrong people in place, you're going to run into some problems. And then the financial piece of it is probably a much harder concept and a much harder issue to truly solve because, again, remember, I was brought in to fix their job costing system. And so if you don't have a really good handle on the job costing system, chances are a lot of the other issues with your finances are going to not get fixed until we fix the job costing situation. So to go from this business to consumer kind of direct business model to a much broader, bigger ticket business model is a really tall order. It's not every business that can weather something like that.
Had they created let's say a target list of distribution partners or potential distributors that they had started to have conversations with before they made this change?
Yeah, they definitely did that part of it. They were making these connections. They were involved in industry trade shows. They were traveling the country doing that, meeting some of the other industry adjacent firms that were already talking to these restaurant owners, and not even just necessarily individual restaurant owners, but some of the bigger chain restaurants have general managers and district managers and other vendors that support, maybe the whole Chicago market, for example, of Burger King, or the whole Los Angeles market of Arby's, or, pick your demographic and then pick a chain restaurant. There are, generally a handful of individuals that support those. And so they definitely had a list. These distribution companies were engaged and they were having conversations.
So now we're looking at the confluence of the new strategy and the people and the old strategy. Were their sales executives fit for purpose to have conversations with these larger organizations?
I'm pretty sure you know the answer to this question, but no, I mean, it's a very different skill set, right? You're talking about going from somebody who's used to processing high volume, hundreds and hundreds of orders a week, to talking a little bit slower. If you take $5 off of a part, you're talking about 10,000 parts. So like, hey, let's slow down on that business decision for a second, kind of mentality shift. And I'm not sure that they understood really what that looked like until they got into it. It changed from needing a order taker mentality. And maybe I'm saying that in a negative way. I don't mean it to be negative, but you truly just needed to be able to process these orders as quickly as possible. I mean, there really wasn't high margins. It was just, can we get it out the door and make a couple of bucks? And you're shifting that, right, to more of an educational model. Well, can we do it more efficiently this way? You ordered 2 weeks ago and your shipping was so much. Could we ask you to maybe place a larger order to reduce your shipping frequency? I mean, some of these problems they didn't really have a good solution for as they were getting into it.
Did they have an operations person who could help the team understand those trade-offs? Who could say, great, you went and got that order. Here are some of the things I see that might help happen or that are likely to happen. Here are the things we need to plan for.
You are obviously an expert, because that is the third. I wrote this down as the third issue, is operations. They did have an operations person. He's really, really brilliant. I don't think that was the limiting factor, but I don't think he had good data. And so when you're trying to do your job and you're trying to plan out, production orders and delivery times and who's got to get to what part of the country and how it's all going to kind of fit together, and operational capacity and manufacturing, capacities, it's really tough to do that when you're using Excel. And so that's the tool of choice that this person used. They had all kinds of Excel files. I mean, I was really blown away by their use of Excel, but it did seem like the operations could have used a little bit of TLC and maybe a kiss of technology to get some software in there to make it run a lot more smoothly.
Had they thought about piloting this before they completely transformed themselves from individual orders to packaged group orders? So did they had they thought about taking a single distribution center or large account and work their way through it?
So Marva, this question is one I'm going to wait to answer, because I think it ties more closely into the solution.
Okay.
And so we'll save that for the third episode. And I'm smiling a little bit because, I knew that I was working with a guru here and an expert of gnarly problems. And so you've gotten into some really interesting issues. I would just love to summarize, and then, we can maybe move on here. This is a manufacturing company that was distributing, parts to restaurants all over the country. And some of the issues they were facing were that their team was feeling a little bit burnt out. Lots of different changes going on in the organization tends to do that. And so especially when you're trying to kind of get the existing staff, been there for a long time, to kind of shift their way of thinking, it's hard to do. And so the staff was feeling a little bit burnt out. The second thing that you brought up, and accurately so, was the financial portion of it. Did they have the financial wherewithal to be able to weather this kind of transition? I would say that they thought that they did, but I think that the reality was maybe they didn't. And then the third issue that you brought up was their operations. And, those are probably the three core functions of the business: the people, the finance, and the operations. And so when you're looking at all three of those as potential issues, you've hit the nail on the head 3 times in a row. Now, your question about piloting a launch here is one that we'll answer in our third episode, because I do think that really kind of gets to the heart of maybe what a potential solution could be, and how that's going to work out. But before we get to that episode, Marva, on our second episode, you and I are going to unpack a couple of cautionary tales. And so these are stories where, maybe we've worked with these business owners and things just didn't go quite the right way. And so the one that I'm looking forward to leading off with is this kiss of death cautionary tale, where you take an order from a Walmart or a Home Depot or one of those types of companies and thinking it's all great and you're going to make a ton of money. It's not necessarily all it's cracked up to be. And so I hope our viewers stick around for our second episode.